Snow fell in great hushed veils, burying the high plains in silence and secrecy. A stagecoach rattled into the storm, carrying a woman with a secret she believed would be her ruin. Her name was Lily Hickok, and she was a mail-order bride, running from a world that had no place for her. She pressed a gloved hand to the fogged window, her reflection a pale ghost against the glass. She carried a truth she hadn't yet spoken to the man waiting for her, a truth that clung to her like the frost itself. She could never bear children, but what nobody in that coach knew, what the man waiting in the storm couldn't possibly imagine, was that her barrenness wasn't her real secret. Her real secret was that she'd watched a man die, and the people who killed him were looking for her. The town rose out of the storm like a mirage of timber and smoke. At the depot, a handful of figures braved the wind. Among them stood Jesse Carver, taller than any man there, broad as the barn doors that marked his sprawling ranch. Snow had settled in his beard and dark hair, and his eyes were as gray and unreadable as the winter sky. Lily stepped down from the coach. The whispers started instantly. "That's her, the mail-order bride." The words snaked through the cold air, cruel in their curiosity. Jesse offered his hand. It was firm, calloused, and unexpectedly gentle. He lifted her trunk as if it weighed nothing and set it on his wagon. He didn't speak. The ride to the ranch was a long, wordless journey into the heart of the storm. Lily stole glances at him, this silent stranger whose life she was about to enter. His silence was a wall she couldn't see past. She wondered if he could already sense the darkness clinging to her. The ranch appeared through the swirling snow like a fortress. Inside, the firelight painted the walls golden. As warmth seeped into her bones, she knew she couldn't delay the first confession, the smaller one. "There is something you should know," she began, her voice a trembling whisper. "I cannot give you children. The doctor told me long ago." The words fell into the room like stones dropped onto a frozen lake. The silence that followed was absolute. Jesse didn't move. He didn't turn. He just stood with his back to her, the firelight flickering across his broad shoulders. Finally, he crossed the room and stood before her. He lifted her chin with one rough, careful hand, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes were deep and searching, but they held no anger, no disgust. "We'll speak on it come morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. And with that, he walked away, leaving her alone by the fire with her half-truth laid bare, her future hanging by a thread in a stranger's house as the storm howled outside. The night was the longest of her life. Morning came, and with it, the relentless work of a ranch in winter. Jesse emerged without a word of judgment and headed for the barn. Lily followed, determined to prove her worth in sweat, if not in bloodline. She broke ice from water troughs and hauled hay until her palms blistered. Jesse watched her, his expression unreadable, but he didn't send her away. His silence was not a rejection, but a test. At night, they sat by the fire, two strangers bound by a contract and an unspoken question. He began leaving his gloves warming on the hearth for her. He mended a tear in her cloak with small, careful stitches. These quiet acts of care confused her more than any words could have. But outside the cabin, the world was not so quiet. In town, whispers followed her like shadows. "A ranch without an heir is a dead ranch," one woman sneered at the mercantile. "Some women are born empty." Lily felt the familiar heat of shame, but then she felt Jesse's presence beside her, a solid wall against their scorn. He didn't speak. He just placed his hand on the small of her back and guided her out of the store. His touch was a shield. That night, she found him sitting on the top rail of the corral fence, staring out at the endless, snow-covered plains. She joined him, the cold seeping through her cloak. "You think you're the only one who carries shame?" he asked suddenly, his voice rough. He told her then of the woman he'd once loved. She'd left him, he said, for a richer man back east, calling him nothing more than a dirt-scratched rancher, a man unworthy of a real legacy. "Children were never the only thing I wanted," he said, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. "I wanted someone who'd stay." The confession was a wound exposed in the cold night air. Without thinking, Lily placed her hand on his. He didn't pull away. His hand closed around hers, a silent pact of shared loneliness. But as winter deepened, Lily knew her own secret was a sleeping wolf. A letter arrived from her hometown, and the familiar handwriting made her blood run cold. It wasn't from her mother. It was a warning. A single sentence scrawled in jagged letters: "We know where you are." That night, with Jesse asleep in the other room, she packed her trunk. She had brought death to his door, and she had to leave before it found him. The creak of the trunk lid was as loud as a gunshot in the silent cabin. "Don't leave me." Jesse's voice came from the doorway, low and broken. He stood barefoot, his face raw with a fear she had never seen in him. It wasn't the fear of storms or predators. It was the fear of being left alone again. The letter slipped from her trembling fingers. She couldn't leave him to face what was coming. She had to tell him the truth. The real truth. "I didn't just leave my home, Jesse," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I fled. A man in my town, a powerful man, was running a smuggling ring. My father discovered it. They killed him, and I saw them do it." Jesse went still, his face hardening into a mask of stone. "They think I'm the only witness left," she choked out. "They'll do anything to silence me. The letter. They've found me." He crossed the room in 2 long strides. He didn't touch her. He just looked down at the letter on the floor, then back at her. The silence in the room was no longer about loneliness. It was about survival. He finally knelt and picked up the letter. He read the single sentence, and a muscle in his jaw twitched. "Let them come," he said, his voice a low growl that seemed to shake the very timbers of the cabin. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not just a lonely rancher, but a man who understood violence. A man who was no stranger to fighting for his life. And in his eyes, she saw a promise. He wouldn't just protect her from the town's gossip. He would protect her from the men who were coming to kill her. The thaw came, but it brought no peace. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Jesse taught her to shoot, his large hands guiding hers on the cold steel of a rifle. "Aim for the chest," he said, his voice flat. "Don't hesitate." They worked to fortify the ranch, reinforcing doors, boarding up windows, turning the isolated cabin into a defensible position. In the shared labor and the quiet, tense evenings, a new intimacy grew. It was a bond forged not in comfort, but in a shared, looming danger. Then the fire came. It wasn't an accident. It started in the barn, a hungry orange glow that devoured the dry timber in minutes. They fought it together, hauling buckets of water, their faces streaked with soot, their lungs burning. Jesse plunged into the inferno to free the trapped horses, and Lily ran in after him, dragging a terrified colt to safety even as sparks singed her dress. By dawn, the barn was a blackened skeleton against the sky. As they stood in the ruins, Jesse found the source, a half-burnt torch and fresh boot prints leading away toward the road. It was a message, a warning. The fire brought the town out. They came with offers of help, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. But among them was a new face, a man who introduced himself as a federal marshal sent to investigate a string of arsons in the territory. His name was Marcus Thorne, and his questions were too sharp, his eyes too knowing. He lingered at the ranch, sketching the scene, interviewing Jesse, his gaze falling on Lily a little too often. A few days later, a wagon train limped into town, carrying families broken by the hard winter. Among them was a small, silent boy, no older than 5, with eyes that had seen too much. He had lost both his parents to fever on the trail. Lily felt an immediate, overwhelming connection to him. She knelt, offering him a piece of bread, and the boy latched onto her hand, refusing to let go. Without discussion, they took him home. Jesse lifted the small child onto the wagon, his movements gentle. The boy, whose name was Sam, rarely spoke, but he followed Lily everywhere, a small, silent shadow. One evening, as Lily was tucking Sam into a small bed they'd made for him by the fire, the boy finally spoke. He was clutching a small carved wooden bird. "Papa made this," he whispered, his voice thin, "before the bad men came." Lily's blood ran cold. "What bad men, Sam?" "The men who hurt Papa," he said, his eyes wide. "The men with the snake tattoo on their hands." Lily felt the air leave her lungs. It was the same tattoo she had seen on the man who killed her father. The smugglers. They hadn't just been on the trail. They were here. The next day, Marshal Thorne returned. As he was questioning Jesse about the fire, Sam ran out of the cabin. When he saw the marshal, he screamed and hid behind Lily, his small body trembling. Thorne's professional calm never wavered, but his eyes narrowed. He knelt down. "What's wrong, son?" Sam pointed a shaking finger at the marshal's wrist, where the edge of a tattoo peeked out from under his cuff. A coiled snake. The world seemed to stop. Thorne wasn't a marshal. He was one of them. He had been using the investigation as a cover to find her, to confirm she was the witness. The barn fire hadn't been a warning. It had been a diversion to bring the law to their door. Jesse moved, placing himself between Lily and Thorne. "I think you should leave," he said, his voice dangerously low. Thorne's smile was thin and cold. He stood up slowly. "I'll be back," he said. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. That night, they didn't sleep. They sat by the fire, rifles across their laps, Sam asleep between them. "They won't come at us head on," Jesse said. "Not now that they know we're ready. They'll wait. They'll try to separate us." He was right. The next morning, a deputy from town rode up with a summons for Jesse, an urgent matter regarding a land dispute. It was a lie, a transparent trap to lure him away from the ranch. "I have to go," Jesse said, his jaw tight. "If I don't, they'll have a reason to come here with force." He looked at Lily, his gray eyes filled with a weight she couldn't decipher. "Barricade the door. Don't open it for anyone. Shoot anything that comes through it that isn't me." He pressed a revolver into her hand. "Sam is your only concern now. Protect the boy." He rode off, leaving Lily and Sam alone in the silent cabin, the vast, empty prairie stretching out around them. The silence was a living thing, filled with menace. Hours passed. The sun crawled across the sky. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made her jump. Then she heard it, the sound of a wagon approaching, not from the direction of town, from the east. She peered through a crack in the boarded-up window. It was Thorne, and he wasn't alone. There were 4 other men with him, all armed. They weren't coming for a fight. They were coming for a siege. But as the wagon drew closer, she saw something that made her heart stop. There was someone else in the wagon, a woman, bound and gagged. It was the woman from Jesse's past, the one he said had left him for a richer man. And Lily realized the terrible final truth. Jesse's past and her present were the same nightmare. The woman hadn't left him. These men had taken her, just like they had taken her father. And Jesse hadn't been just a lonely rancher when she arrived. He was a man waiting for a war. Thorne's wagon creaked to a halt 100 yards from the cabin. His voice carried on the wind, cold and clear. "Lily Hickok, we know you're in there, and we have an old friend of Jesse's." He pulled the gag from the woman's mouth. Her name was Clara, and her eyes were wide with a terror that was 15 years old. "Jesse!" she screamed, her voice raw. Lily's mind reeled. This was the woman Jesse had loved, the one whose betrayal had carved him hollow. But he had been lied to. They had taken her, framed it as abandonment, and left him with a wound that never healed. They had used his grief to isolate him, to make him the perfect, unsuspecting guardian of the land they used for their smuggling routes. Her own arrival had been a random, tragic coincidence that had upset their entire operation. "Send out the boy, Lily," Thorne shouted. "The boy is the only other person who saw us. Give us the boy, and we'll let Clara go. A fair trade." It was a monstrous choice. Sam, the innocent child who had stumbled into their web, for the woman Jesse thought he had lost forever. Sam whimpered, clutching Lily's skirt. She looked down at his terrified face, then back out at the wagon. She saw the snake tattoos on the men's hands. She saw the cold certainty in Thorne's eyes. He would kill them all anyway. He couldn't afford to leave any witnesses. Her hand tightened on the revolver Jesse had given her. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was a protector. "No deal!" she shouted back, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Thorne laughed. "Have it your way." He gave a signal and his men dismounted, spreading out, taking cover behind rocks and trees. The siege had begun. Lily moved fast, her mind sharp with adrenaline. She placed Sam in the root cellar under the floorboards. "Stay here," she whispered. "Don't make a sound no matter what you hear." She gave him the small wooden bird. "Hold this tight." Then she went to the window, rifle in hand. She wasn't the trembling woman who had arrived in a snowstorm. Winter and Jesse Carver had forged her into something harder, something that wouldn't break. The first shot splintered the wood next to her head. She didn't flinch. She fired back, her aim steady. The hours that followed were a blur of smoke and splintered wood. They fired on the cabin relentlessly, trying to flush her out. She moved from window to window, firing sparingly, making every shot count, creating the illusion that there was more than one person inside. But she knew she couldn't hold them off forever. Her ammunition was running low. The sun was beginning to set, and in the darkness, they would storm the cabin. Just as despair began to creep in, she heard it. A single powerful gunshot from the ridge behind the cabin. It wasn't one of Thorne's men. It was a heavier caliber, a buffalo rifle. One of the smugglers cried out and fell. Jesse. He hadn't gone to town. He had known it was a trap. He had circled back, climbing the high ground, waiting for his moment. His second shot took down another man. Panic erupted among Thorne's crew. They were caught in a crossfire. They had expected a lone, frightened woman, not a seasoned fighter picking them off from an elevated position. Thorne screamed at his men to fall back, to take cover. He dragged Clara from the wagon, using her as a human shield as he retreated toward the cover of the woods. Jesse's rifle fell silent. He wouldn't risk hitting Clara. Lily knew this was her only chance. She burst from the cabin, revolver in hand, and ran straight at Thorne. It was a suicidal charge, but it was the only move she had. Thorne, surprised by her sudden appearance, shoved Clara to the ground and raised his pistol. But he was too slow. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Lily's gun. It came from the direction of the woods. Thorne staggered, a red flower blooming on his chest. He looked down in disbelief, then collapsed. Out of the trees stepped the last person Lily ever expected to see. The town's sheriff, a man she had always thought of as quiet and ineffective. He held a smoking rifle in his hands. Behind him came a dozen men from the town, ranchers and storekeepers armed with hunting rifles and shotguns. They had seen Jesse ride out, seen Thorne's men follow. They had put the pieces together. The whispers and the scorn had finally given way to something else. Loyalty. Jesse came down from the ridge, his face grim. He ran to Clara, helping her to her feet, his hands gentle on her bruised arms. For a moment, they just stared at each other, 15 years of lies and pain passing between them in a single, silent look. Lily watched them, her heart a tangled mess of relief and a new, sharp pain. She had saved him, but she had also returned him to the woman he had always loved. She had won the battle, only to lose the one thing she hadn't known she wanted until it was no longer hers. She turned away, intending to slip back to the cabin, to leave them to their reunion. Lily. Jesse's voice stopped her. She turned back. He was looking at her, and Clara was looking at her too. There was no triumph in Clara's eyes, only a deep, weary gratitude. "You're the one he told me about," Clara whispered. "The one who stayed." Jesse walked to Lily, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped in front of her, his gray eyes searching hers. "She was my past," he said, his voice quiet but clear enough for everyone to hear. He took Lily's hand. "But you are my future." He had made his choice, not between two women, but between the ghost of a life that was stolen from him and the promise of a new one that had been forged in fire and snow. He squeezed her hand. "A family isn't just born from blood," he said, repeating the words he had spoken in the mercantile. "It's made, and we're making ours." He led her back to the cabin, where Sam was just peeking out from the root cellar door. Jesse knelt and scooped the boy into his arms. Lily stood beside them, her hand on Sam's back, and as the townspeople watched, they saw not a broken rancher and a barren bride, but a family, whole and unbroken, standing together against the fading light. The fire had taken their barn, but it had given them something far greater. It had burned away the lies, the secrets, and the shame, leaving only the truth. And the truth was, they were home. If you enjoyed this story of a love that defied all expectations, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We've got another story coming tomorrow that you won't want to miss.